Excuse me.
It's delayed because of the train.
Order, order. Welcome to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is our penultimate hearing as part of our counter-terrorism inquiry. The last will be with ministers. Aimen, grateful if you can kindly introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Aimen Dean, and in a past life I used to work in an undercover capacity for the UK intelligence and security services.
Do you have any declarations you need to make before we start?
I don't think there is anything relevant, apart from the fact that I worked in banking, so yeah.
Perfect. And as obviously you know, parliamentary privilege does apply. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. You joined al-Qaeda in the 90s. I'm interested in your view of how you think al-Qaeda has changed as an organisation since then, particularly kind of post a 9/11 period, and how you think the ideology and their objectives have shifted since then, and also since the emergence of Daesh as part of that.
Well, they moved from analog to digital. I mean, that's exactly what happened. And then after that, they kept changing their objectives from global to regional to local, and they adapted according to whatever branch they have established in whatever country. Like in Yemen, they have their own different goals and aspirations. In Somalia, Shabab, even though they declared their allegiance to al-Qaeda, but nonetheless they remain committed to the Horn of Africa and to their objectives in the Horn of Africa. So they changed, really.
And forgive me, why do you think AQ was able to remain resilient despite the death of bin Laden?
At the end of the day, I think al-Qaeda was about an idea that it is part of a civil war within Islam, if we can call it this way, because there is a war between those who believe in the nation state, as a concept, an institution, a perfect model to live in the 20th and 21st century, and those who believe in transnational ideologies. In other words, empire building. So the idea is that all of these borders need to be raised in order to create that pan-Islamic caliphate. Yeah. Al-Qaeda started that aspiration, and then slowly, gradually, other groups picked up on that, including ISIS.
And why do you think the Horn of Africa has become this hub for al-Qaeda? Obviously, I think historically back to my childhood, where yes, you had Bosnia and Chechnya, but a lot of the activity was in the Middle East. So why do you think the Horn of Africa has become this new hub for them?
Wherever there are ungoverned spaces and chaos and lack of central governance, you always find this disease, spreading around. That's why we call them non-state actors, because they flourish in places where the rule of law and governance is so weak.
And in contrast to that, so the Emirati foreign minister back in 2017 said that Europe was going to become, or should be classed as, an incubator of terrorism, and that he thought that the route for radicalism was becoming a lot more ripe within Europe. So how does that sit with your explanation of being ungoverned spaces? And do you think that was a fair explanation for him to make, or statement for him to make?
Not necessarily, because when we talk about ungoverned spaces, we're talking about the place where the authority, the ability to carry arms and to establish, authority by force, that's where you have the proliferation of such ideology. If you look, for example, however, for radicalization, that's a different issue altogether. If you look at Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, we are looking at the two far ends of the spectrum in the Arab world. One is secular and the other is conservative, at least until recently. So Saudi Arabia, during the height of the recruitment for ISIS, roughly about 145 per million joined ISIS. Tunisia was fiercely secular under Habib Bourguiba, and then after that under Ben Ali. It was absolutely secular, and yet immediately after the Arab Spring and then the rise of ISIS, 206 out of every million joined ISIS. It was more than any other Arab country. So it's not necessarily because the environment is secular and there is a strong rule of law and there is a strong government. I think there are other factors at play. And if you compare even Tunisia to Europe, The UK, 345 out of a million, France, 354 out of a million, Belgium, 722 out of a million. So the numbers are really big, even bigger than that in Europe.
Yeah, well, Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more, about the motivations underlying the reasons that people join jihadist terror groups. Have those reasons evolved? Are they more complex now than they were, say, 25 years ago or 24 years ago, since 2001? Is it to do with increasing inequality in society? Is it, as you said, to do with ungoverned spaces, the rule of law? Is it just to do with a perception of decadence and Islamophobia? Can you tell us a bit more?
There's so much to unpack here, but I can tell you that we have to understand that no one wakes up one day and decide, oh, today I'm going to be a terrorist. I'm going to join a terrorist group and I'm going to go and kill everyone around. No, it doesn't happen like that. It all starts with good intentions. It all starts with good intentions. The path to hell is paved with good intention. And this is why in Islamic principles that good intentions are not good enough. You need to have wisdom with it. However, when I was 16, wisdom was in short supply. And I think even when you are 26 and even 36, still wisdom is in short supply. So this is the role of the elders. And this is why, when the elders neglect their duties in sharing their wisdom with the young and trying to tell them that don't do this, don't go down this path, it will lead only to suffering, misery, and death and destruction. If these voices were more amplified, then things would have been different. But unfortunately, these voices were more muffled, actually, than amplified. The reality is that there are many complex answers for this. It includes, grievance, but not all grievances are legitimate. Just because someone wants to build an empire, oh, I want to build my empire, get out of my way, that is not a legitimate, grievance. Then you have the question of Western culture being dominant. People just get angry and frustrated about it. So they feel their voices are silenced. I'm talking about certain parts of the Arab and Muslim world. And then you have the desire for empowerment. That's an important motivation. You see many of these people, as soon as they are ending up in these jihad theaters, if you can call it this way, you see them taking pictures and posing with weapons, and they feel that sense of pride. They feel that there is that, empowerment, because they feel that they are marginalized, they feel powerless wherever they came from, and then once they are there, that inner desire for power is liberated. And this is one of the reasons why prisons were a fertile ground for recruitment, because many of these people experience humiliation, but also experience guilt about the things they've done. So when there is an ideology that comes that offers redemption through struggle and fighting and dying for a cause, while at the same time liberating the inner sadism in order to become violent, but in a way that is rewarding. If we could talk about it, I could be talking about it for hours. Just to explain the multi-layered, complex nature of radicalization. And this is why there isn't one single jihadi prototype. I used to see all people, from the PhDs all the way down to the prison graduates.
Would it be fair to say that one of the antidotes to violent radicalization might be education?
It's at the core of it. Not just only education, but critical thinking. Without asking people to really look deep into the consequences of their actions, and at the same time understanding that the world is far more complex. If you tell people, this is the nation state you live in, but if you try to bring down that nation state, the result will be there will be no ATM outside to withdraw cash. There will be no ambulance to come and pick you up. There will be no school to educate you and your kids. There will be no police to come and help you if there is anything that it goes wrong. That is, I think, when we start to tell people that don't bring down the state structure, because what will replace it will be far worse.
Can I then ask you how you think the UK, and this should be an area you know quite a bit about, how the UK can disrupt the appeal of jihadist terrorism. I mean, what factors, we've already talked about some of the factors that draw recruits from the West to groups such as Daesh and al-Qaeda. But can you tell us a bit more about how we could disrupt this?
The best way to disrupt, and there aren't any silver bullets here, but the best way to disrupt is always debate. And the reason for debate is because that is how you insert the virus of doubt into the minds of those who would use the absolute certainty of their faith to carry out unspeakable atrocities. I mean, so how do you stop someone from taking a knife and stabbing someone and taking someone else's life? If you put a doubt in his mind that, well, you do that, you're not going to end up somewhere nice. In fact, like you will have to answer and pay for what you've done. So inserting doubt, even 1%, 2%, 3% doubt into the mind of someone who just went into that path of radicalism could disable that violent threshold, basically.
Can you tell us a bit more, I mean, in your view, I mean, you've mentioned this already, about the types of people who join jihadist terror groups? You mentioned the PhD graduate and then the prison graduate, but is there a particular character trait or multiple character traits that push people towards jihadist terror and violence more so than any other?
Within the jihadist context, there is one common denominator, which is redemption and seeking redemption, because in a sense, unlike Catholicism, where you go to a priest, you confess your sins, and and that's it, you gain absolution. There isn't that system within Islam. I mean, you have to repent directly to God, and you have no idea if your repentance is accepted. And also at the same time, there has been some crisis in the state of preaching within Muslim societies over the past 50, 60, 70 years because of the advent of Western culture and liberal values. So preaching in Islam used to be based on 3 pillars: love, hope, and fear. You love the Lord, you hope for His reward, and you fear His damnation. So a standard preaching will be to divide your preaching into 3/3. However, I think the emphasis on damnation and the eternal punishment has pushed significant number of young people to think, that's it, I have no hope. The way I'm listening to preaching these days, people just keep telling their congregations, out of love, of course, out of the idea that they want to safeguard their congregations from whatever temptations, that if you drink, hell; if you smoke, hell; if you deal drugs, hell; if you join a gang, hell. But there isn't that incentive that, well, if you don't do any of this, you'll go to heaven. I mean, so they have replaced, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, replaced hope with fear. And that created a generation of guilty people, who would say haram to everything, who will say, that, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't greet people for Christmas. You shouldn't, mix with people who are outside of our faith circle. You see, it starts with guilt, and then that guilt, unfortunately, again, through the desire to do good, end up in a way that people end up doing bad.
Can I ask you, to that point around critical thinking, a lot of people who've left terrorist groups talk about having that moment when they realise that, for example, why is it my leaders keep asking me to blow myself up, and why they want me to have this great, eternal, hopeful future, but they don't want it themselves. Was there a turning point for you where you thought, I need to leave al-Qaeda, or was it that you were just approached by an effective recruiter? And then what was it? There's one thing to leave an organisation, there's another to actively turn against them and to obviously work against them for the secret services. Can you talk us through what that journey was for you?
Doubt. It's all started with doubt. I think the first thing, you have to have something like of a moral compass pointing true north, a little bit at least. And on top of this, the fact that you have also that fear of God, that, you don't want to do the wrong thing. And so you become more and more inquisitive about the legitimacy of whatever, you are asked to do. So it was the East Africa bombings, 1998. So I remember that day etched in my memory. It was 4th of August. And when it happened, Of course, I was shocked by the number of civilian casualties. I mean, there were 12 American diplomats killed, but there were more than 220 innocent people from Tanzanians, Kenyans, Somalians, Ugandans. I mean, and that was, too much for me even to contemplate and to understand even, and to put it within a context, to justify it. And I wasn't thinking that this is what's going to be. I thought prior to that, and this is the first time al-Qaeda used a terrorism on a massive scale, I thought we are joining al-Qaeda in order to really harass the US forces within the Middle East, not go and kill innocent people, going about their own daily lives in Africa. This is where it all started.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Aimen. Can I ask, how successful is groups like al-Qaeda and Daesh's online radicalization? Who is most vulnerable to it? And how influential are their online magazines? Who are they targeting?
In the 1990s, recruitment used to be peer-to-peer because it was really, there was no digital means. And so you have to go and recruit people one by one, more or less just like a fishing rod, and you have to catch them one by one. The net really brought the era of the net. And you have a whole net cast wide in order to catch as many people as possible, because in the past, you couldn't invade 100,000 living rooms, 100,000 smartphones, 100,000 bedrooms at night, with your videos, with your tweets, with your posts, with your secret Telegram postings. This wasn't possible. But you see, the explosion, and no pun intended, the explosion in the number of recruits took place as the means of communication became more prevalent and easy and widespread. And that started even to target more people who are tech savvy, people who are, curious. Who are they? The young. I remember that in the 1990s, I was maybe the youngest or one of the youngest people there. But then, you start to see in the 2000s, the age bracket started to drop to the point where we started to see ISIS recruiting children, not only basically from the male side of it, but also from the female side.
What steps do you think the UK could be taking to tackle this threat?
There are no more effective measures than the seeds of doubt, always. You have to destroy the credibility of the people who carry out the recruitment. Why don't you go? Why is it that you want me to go, but your kids are going to this university or to this college, or they are enjoying life in this public school? I mean, why is it that you get to enjoy the fruits of this life, but you're more than happy to send other people to their slaughter? I think there is always that. It's the same way in the other area that I work more constantly, which is terrorism finance. Not that I provide terrorism finance, like counter-terrorism finance. So in that field, the disruption happened through highlighting how most of that money end up in the pockets of those who are raising it, and doesn't actually reach even the groups that the donations were intended to. And so through highlighting the embezzlement of those who are raising funds, and because fundraising and recruitment go hand in hand, by the way, so when you do that, you start to hurt both fundraising and recruitment.
Do you think we're doing that? Or is that?
Not effectively.
Can I just quickly, before I bring in Neil, ask you, it was interesting when you said about the move to starting recruiting women. When you joined al-Qaeda, were they actively targeting women in the 90s, or was it solely people to fight? And do you think it is that transition towards the creation of a caliphate and therefore the need for repopulation? Or do you think that there's something else that suddenly saw them wanting to target women and bring more women to join them and on that path of radicalization?
I think it was, when the jihad started to take root in Syria, that the idea of a territory, and a territory needs to be populated, that women need to be recruited. I remember that al-Qaeda was entirely male dominated, and the females were just only the wives or the daughters and the sisters of, the senior people even. Most of us were just single men.
It was a practical requirement rather than some great rejuvenation that actually recruiting women and, yeah.
Yeah, recruitment of women became, prevalent because it was a necessity.
Thank you. Neil?
It used to be the case that in prison and online were the two key areas for radicalisation. Is that still the worst place to be radicalised, or are they the worst places to be radicalised? And I think you just said there wasn't sufficient effectiveness in tackling online radicalisation. So what more powers or resources are needed to tackle the problem?
The three key areas where people are vulnerable, you're talking about the online space, you're talking about university campuses, and prisons. I know these three are far in between, they almost make a triangle. But the reality is that university campuses is where people go there in order to think they will change the world. And when you offer someone the means to change the world, through a radical way, some of them unfortunately will take it. In prison, these are souls looking for three things mainly: redemption, empowerment, and the means to liberate their inner violent, sadism. And online, this is where people who are curious, who want to know, they want to find out answers. And the problem with online is the fact that it all starts with several, starting points. There isn't one starting point. Some people start from the conspiracy theories. This world is run by a certain group of people, a cabal or whatever, and we have to fight against this cabal. And so they are drawn to conspiracy theories, and then that conspiracy theories then lead them down the path of, well, I must do something. Other people end up in the world of fantasies invented, due to civil wars within Islam, dynastic actually wars within Islam, 1300 years ago, in order to look into prophecies, eschatology, and about the end of time. And well, these are the battles at the end of time. God ordained this fight, and I need to join it. Who am I to argue with the divine? I need to join this fight. So again, it's a really complex phenomenon.
They're not being taught this in university. You're saying that they sort of hang on to an idea and then explore it further, and that's where the conspiracies come in. So is this, the algorithm of escalation for both right-wing and Islamic jihadist extremism, are the platforms doing enough to tackle that? And does the government have sufficient powers to be monitoring and intervening to try and prevent that escalator?
It's not about power. It's about knowledge. If I tell you about an object that you have to look for me, but I tell you this is the object, but I don't give you any good description, how will you find it? So first of all, those who are supposed to enforce the laws and regulations and the powers, they need to know what they're looking for first in the first place. And this is, I think, one of the reasons is just I think it's just the lack of awareness and the lack of full understanding, a holistic approach to what actually makes a jihadist, because there isn't one single journey. You have to imagine jihad as a river, and all the other factors are tributaries to it.
Actually, just on that point about redemption, empowerment, and you said inner means of sadism for prisoners. Isn't it also, is there a link between university and prison in that both are seeking a sense of order and ideology? Maybe more of an ideology at university, but a sense of order in their lives at prison, and radical Islamicism provides that.
Just like with the reality is that most of the, I would call it the Islamist ideology-driven groups, and I'm talking here about, when I say Islamist, I mean political Islam. Yeah, that's what I mean. So most of these groups actually were founded in universities. This is where it all started, because they think that the world is chaotic around them. That, and especially during the 50s and 60s, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and jihadism is because of, that pull and push between, communism and capitalism, between socialism and, free market. And the question is, as the Muslim world is being squeezed, from both sides, why aren't we united? And everyone started to yearn and become nostalgic to an era that actually hardly existed. It's just a romanticizing of the history led to the idea that we could all be united, one big large empire, which basically never happened in the entire history of Islam except for 59 years. So this is, I think, where this ideology of empowerment, but similar to how communism started, the idea is a world revolution in order to unite all the people in one happy, semi-utopian empire, but it's just not going to work.
And when you're talking about that, you're talking about Sayyid Qutb, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Just looking at the structure of his ideas, do you think there is a similarity in structure, although clearly very different, because one was very secular, one was very religious, between Qutb and between the Bolsheviks and sort of Marxist-Leninism, or do you think in their structure they're really very different?
Actually, Sayyid Qutb in his early life was a socialist. And so therefore, he was affected and influenced by socialism. And the idea is that, to borrow the framework of socialist, society and a structure of governance and to bring it into Islam in order to create that revolutionary sense. Islam generally wasn't really revolutionary throughout 1300 years of its existence. It was more of a religion that left the leadership of the state to statesmen, kings, royals, princes, tribal leaders, but did not involve the clergy in the ruling. I mean, the first cleric since the Prophet Muhammad to actually ascend into power in any Muslim community was Khomeini. And there is 1400 years difference between the two, and that tells you that Islam never actually gave ruling and the governance to the clergy. It gave it to to the ruling class. Who are the ruling class? Merchants.
Dan, I think you wanted to comment on that point.
Yeah. In your view, what is the most effective form of government to counter the threat of radicalization and terrorism, for instance, monarchies, autocratic leaderships in the Middle East?
The reality is that the Middle East is a complex place, and I always advise people, especially from the private sector, is not to refer to the Middle East as just one homogeneous zone. There are two zones there. There is the royal zone and there is the non-royal zone. So the royal zone, inherently stable. The non-royal zone is inherently unstable. And there is a reason for that. The Middle East is the birth of monarchy, and from the beginning, King Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi and the Mesopotamian kingdoms, and then it spread throughout. It's been around for about 7,000 years, I think, this kind of system. I think we more or less see that it has established its roots and its legitimacy. So in tribal societies, what is a king but a glorified tribal sheikh at the end of the day? And therefore, the social contract between kings and their people is far more binding than autocratic generals or dictatorial presidents of a republic. Because there is a difference. The king is looked at as a legitimate form of governance that's been around for thousands of years, while the other one is just a usurper who just took the place. He's a commoner like the rest of us. Why is he better than the rest of us? And I think this is why you see the difference here, that the countries in the Arab world, the 6 GCC countries plus Jordan and Morocco, despite everything, despite all the challenges, they are resilient. And that all the countries where the monarchies ended up overthrown, Iraq, Libya, Iran, you can tell what really happened they became inherently unstable.
What do you think about how we, as democracies, engage with those types of leaderships? Because often we will have our own views of leadership, of our values of democracy. Do you think would you just comment on how we engage with those types of countries?
It's by acknowledging that, while democracy is the most admirable governance system that man has created so far, it cannot always be applied overnight, and there has to be that kind of transition. And the best vehicle for transition into that system, is the monarchies. One of the greatest missed opportunities in Afghanistan was when the US objected to the return of King Mohammad Zahir Shah to Afghanistan. He would have united everyone, including the Taliban, eventually, because kings command in a tribal society far greater status and far greater legitimacy, and therefore their words are heeded. The oath of allegiance in Islam given to kings is the same as the one that is given to a caliph. So there is that religious anointment, let's put it this way, an ordination to this oath that you give to the king. And therefore, I think it was a missed opportunity, because then, Afghanistan ended up where it is right now, 20 years later. And I think this is why the engagement need to be first by accepting that this is the current reality. We can work with it because that is the best outcome right now. Any attempt to destabilize it is going to create even more trouble down the line.
And beyond monarchy, what other factors do you think bring about stability in the region? Can you think of any?
Preservation of tradition, while at the same time introducing modernity, both socially, economically, and in the field of science. That is important. It's like the steady ship, going forward. There is no going backward. And this is why you will see that only the monarchies in the Middle East seems to have improved their HDI more than any other of their neighbors. Just look at the Human Development Index of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and compare it to Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and the rest. It's just abysmal for the rest, while it's almost approaching European standards in the GCC countries.
Just on that final point, is that because those people that took power did so in the name of socialism or communism, which has not been particularly successful in many human societies, and effectively kings have allowed a sort of something approaching a democratic capitalism, or is it more complex than that?
It is more complex because Iran is theocracy. I mean, in the name of religion, and yet it's a failed state. Taliban is going to be a failed state at some point. So this is why it is important to understand that it's not just because the abandonment of Islamic traditions, because kings within a tribal sector, a tribal society, do actually have a responsibility of preserving tradition. And under that umbrella of tradition is religion. So they are viewed as the guardians of, virtue, values, and therefore no one questions whether they are legitimate or not, and whether the way they run their government is legitimate, even though countries such as the UAE or Kuwait are absolutely liberal, by any standards in the Arab world, and yet, there is the sense that their leaders are also the guardians of conservative values.
Once a monarch loses their role in Afghanistan, for example, isn't it almost impossible to bring that monarch back? Because once the magic of the irrational idea of monarchy goes, it's very, very difficult to recreate. And you're assuming that in Afghanistan it could have been recreated.
Because the last king was still alive at that time. This is why there was a chance. There was just that chance, and his memory was still there.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask about the potential impact of October the 7th and the conflict in Gaza on the growth of radicalisation, and how concerned we should be about that? And is there evidence that al-Qaeda, Daesh, the Iranian proxies, for example, have exploited the conflict? And have you seen a greater level in support and funding of those groups since October the 7th? And where should we be looking for that potential growth and those dangers?
Please keep going.
Okay. Just making sure, like I don't have to.
No, bless you. No, there are no votes. No, go on.
Go under. Okay. When it comes to terrorism, is cyclical. There is that, cycles like the moon. So I always used to say that, we always have that full moon sometime. We had Afghanistan in the 1980s, we had Bosnia and Chechnya in the 1990s, we had Iraq in the noughties, we had Syria in the 2010s. So this is when, a new moon with this gravity, bringing, out all of this, upheaval, and causing people to become lunatic. And so this is, I think, where we have a situation now where Gaza is now the new Syria. This is the gravitational pull that is bringing people, or bringing out the worst in people, unfortunately. Again, because the lack of wisdom, lack of understanding, lack of awareness. So for example, when you talk about October 7th, the question is, yes, Hamas did it, but since 2014, it is my assessment that Hamas ceased to be a national Palestinian liberation movement and became an Iranian tool. So it wasn't doing anything on behalf of the average Palestinian, it was doing it on behalf of the Ayatollahs of Tehran. And so this is why, and yet, many people still are blind to this fact. So this blindness is the lack of awareness, lack of education, lack of wisdom. People are not confronting back with, facts and evidence-based facts, and therefore, when the narrative is hijacked by radicals who try to simplify this whole complex conflict, when in fact it is as complex as it could be, this is when radicalization happened. And unfortunately, since October 7, a revival of ISIS in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and also a revival of al-Qaeda in Yemen, and we start to see more funding going to al-Shabaab in Somalia. We started to see the Taliban also improving their funding mechanism, especially through trade in commodities. All of this highlight the fact that Gaza became a lucrative brand in itself, not only just for the Sunni terrorist groups, but also for the Iranian Shia threat network, such as Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and the militias in Iraq.
Is there any evidence? You talked a lot there about Syria, Iraq, and Somalia. Is there any evidence of a domestic upsurge? Should we be aware of anything that's going on domestically and increased radicalisation since October the 7th?
I don't think there is anything that basically make it domestic, in places like Yemen and Iraq and Syria, because the war has been going on there for years and years. The conflict and the dynamics of the conflict been there for a very long time. It's just the opportunity. Again, that cycle, that new moon that has risen, called Gaza, it is the best way to exploit people's emotions, anger, frustration, and it is a perfect neon sign for recruitment.
Can I just finally, this last question, just take you back to something you said way at the beginning about the nation state and that pivot. Well, the question would be, has there been a pivot away from that sort of global transnational terrorism to more of a sort of localised focus? And is there any evidence for that?
You will see that in the protests around the globe, or in the recruitment efforts, or in the fundraising, Gaza plays an important part, and yet how many of those involved are actually originally Palestinians, from Gaza or even the West Bank or from the diaspora. You will find that the majority are actually non-Palestinians, some of them non-Arabs, from the Indian subcontinent or from sub-Saharan Africa. So you see that, so really they are not galvanized by domestic nation-state concerns. They are actually galvanized by this notion of pan-Islamic solidarity as a precursor towards a pan-Islamic action to establish, a caliphate again. The idea of the caliphate started to take, center stage again. Just look at what happened in Hamburg just a few days ago, when a group of protesters in their hundreds, carrying black flags and chanting, slogans for the return of the caliphate in Hamburg, in Germany.
Thank you.
Neil.
And some of the protests that we've seen here, we've seen the emergence or re-emergence, if you like, of some terrorist paraphernalia, including Hamas's paraphernalia, including on the streets of London. Do you feel the police are trained sufficiently to identify and intervene when we see the symbols, the flags, the leaflets, the literature, and is Prevent? I know Prevent is overseen by the Home Office rather than Foreign Office, but is Prevent resourced enough, do you feel, to intervene to prevent people going down a path of radicalisation?
Again, the domestic issues here are very complex because of the sacred laws when it comes to freedom of speech. And so the question is, how do you define the very thin line between free speech and incitement? And what is it that actually caused radicalization, and what is it that is just political, speech? It might be radical, it might be not to the taste of everyone, but it is still a legitimate speech in the mind of those who, authored it. I think it is quite subjective, and it is really up to, the authorities to judge case by case. But if, let's say, there is, as Hamas is a proscribed organization, if their literature were to be spread, then this is in itself an incitement. This is in itself a crime. The question is, does the police take action? Generally speaking, my experience over the past 25 years looking at how different governments around the world deal with terrorism is the fact that, the more you try to appease people to avoid confrontation, will invite confrontation. So the more you show moral backbone and the bravery to confront and head on, not try to skirt around it, that would generate that level of not only just fear, but respect from the other side in order to step back and to think about what they're doing.
Thank you.
Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to remember when there was last a caliphate in Hamburg, but I can't kind of work that one out. Can I move on to financing terrorism? Because I think they often say if you want to stop a criminal action, you follow the money. So how did the financing of terrorism evolve, do you think, in the wake of restrictions imposed following 9/11? How do you expect it to change in the next few years? Who are the main donors and finances of jihadist terror groups? Because, I wonder where they're located and what their motivation is. Why would they give money? Is it to fund terror from a shared ideology, or is it to leverage specific geopolitical outcomes? Sorry, multifaceted question.
No. At some point, I remember in 2016, I was, standing for 8 hours on my feet explaining to the captains of the diamond industry in the Antwerp World Diamond Center, how terrorism finance work, and it took 8 hours, just including question and answer. So it's a really complex place, but I can just condense it and to say that terrorist groups, are two, categories: state-sponsored and the non-state sponsored. So the state sponsored, something like Hezbollah, the Houthis, because they have a state sponsor such as Tehran. So, and then of course, like, they have other means of funding, including criminal enterprises, weapons smuggling, narcotics becoming an important staple of Hezbollah and the Syrian regime. Financing, for example, like the Captagon, which is called the zombie drug, which is even started to become available here in the streets of the UK and Germany and France. Like, this is all manufactured in Syria and manufactured in Lebanon and then shipped here. But before that, it used to be, what was the target? The target was Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait. And we're talking about multi-billion-dollar business, annually. So this is the state sponsor. Now, if we go to the non-state sponsors, such as al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, al-Shabaab, there are multitude of funding streams. So you have donations coming from the diasporas or coming from the ideologically like-minded people who see in their struggle a kindred spirit, something like, basically that they share with. It's a common cause. However, also there is the business networks. What many people don't understand is the fact that al-Qaeda in the 1990s, the precursor to ISIS, which was the ISI or the Islamic State of Iraq in the 2000s, they built a network of businesses, farms, consumer goods places, cafes and restaurants, retail, in order to generate funds to keep laundering that cash and to make sure basically that they have a network of intelligence gathering through these shops and the legitimate businesses, but also at the same time in order to generate funds. Exploitation of natural resources, that's what the Shabaab do with the coal and copper of Somalia and selling it in the markets in Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia. Of course, you have the Hawala system. The Hawala system in itself is alive. In fact, it hasn't been even better than before. And the reason is because of the conflicts. The conflicts have now driven tens of millions of people out of their homes. In Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Iran, in Pakistan, Afghanistan. So you end up with tens of millions of people fueling this black economy. So hiding among those big numbers, like you are now hiding maybe 20, 40, 50 needles within one single haystack, within billion haystacks,
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
I think that's a really interesting point you make, because you said earlier that radicalisation and finance go hand in hand. And exactly that point, Daesh, most of its funding came from small Western Union transfers of less than 50 quid at a time from the UK. It wasn't the billions coming or the millions coming from big donors. It's this small scale. You might compare it to some political parties who are more focused on small donations than they are on the big ones now. Royston, you wanted to come in, however, on the state sponsor point.
Yeah. Can I talk to you about involving terrorists in political settlements? So you talked, I think, earlier about appeasement and show of strength and confronting the ideology or the terrorists. But an alternative, and we're seeing it in Yemen, where the Houthis may well be part of a political settlement. Is that a good or a bad thing?
A political settlement can be reached if the objective, of the group in question revolves around power and revolves around material gains. The problem is if the group in question is not concerned with borders, with staying within the confines of the internationally accepted borders, then we have a problem. Ideologically driven groups such as Hamas, the Houthis, and others basically have the idea that these borders are artificial and these are the construct of colonial era that needs to be deleted, needs to be erased, needs to be gone. And I think this is where the question is, how do you then expect to have a rational outcome from someone who might not be entirely rational. They might be rational tactically, but the strategy is not rational. So, and I think this is the exasperation that was expressed by multiple regional leaders in the GCC when they complained publicly on TV about the irrationality of the other side. Article 5 of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Article 5 of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran stipulate that who the leader of the country. Now you might think like in the leader of the country is Ayatollah Khamenei, like he's a supreme leader, but really the real leader, he's just a deputy. The real leader is someone who's been missing for 1,200 years. So you have a child, a 5-year-old who disappeared 1,200 years ago, and just so happened that this child is, by the Article 5 of the Iranian Constitution, is the leader of the state. Ayatollah Khamenei and before him Khomeini are just his deputies, waiting for his return. So this is why the Constitution says during his occultation, someone will deputize on his behalf. Someone who has to be a grand cleric, and brave and knowledgeable and experienced. So this is the first red flag of irrationality. So you are waiting for someone, this isn't like, basically a traditional, either monarchical or secular or liberal or even conservative. This is just something out of the realm of rationality, and we have to deal with it. Yet, this particular problem of eschatology, which I talked about as being the driving force for terrorism and radicalism across the Muslim world, both the Sunni and the Shia divide, is what is causing most of our problems right now. The Mahdi, the idea that there is this Messiah figure coming, is driving Hezbollah, driving the Houthis, driving the Shia militias. It drove al-Qaeda before, it drove ISIS before, because everyone have the idea that they are paving the way for a savior. So this eschatology, and I wrote a long paper about it before, about 13 years ago, where I talked about it in a sense that it's going to poison the minds of so many people, especially young people, by convincing them that you are God's instruments and therefore you must join God's army. And that's exactly where we are right now. So what is the battle cry for the Iran-sponsored Shia terrorist? Labbaika ya Mahdi. We are here for you, Mahdi. And what is the battle cry for al-Qaeda and ISIS and al-Shabaab? We are here to establish the state for the Mahdi. So we are caught between two, unfortunately, radical visions that are fed by eschatology that is not even rooted properly in Islamic texts.
Can I ask you then about, the West seemed to look in the wrong direction when a lot of these organisations are becoming more radicalised and more capable. Are we in danger of seeing that again, either in Afghanistan or in Yemen, where in the last few weeks AQAP have carried out attacks on the recognised government of Yemen and are said to be working now with hand in glove with the Houthis, who are releasing al-Qaeda prisoners and supplying them with drones and the rest. Are we in danger of seeing this happen again just somewhere else, and the West not looking or seeing it coming so much? So is their capabilities increasing in places like Afghanistan and Yemen and elsewhere?
Yes. Because the idea of using al-Qaeda and other Sunni radical groups, including Hamas, is something that Iran perfected over the past 2.5 decades. In 2002 and 3 and 4, when I used to work for the UK intelligence services abroad in Arabia, the orders used to come to al-Qaeda from where? From Iran. So Hamza Rabi', who used to be the head of al-Qaeda's operational command, was based out of Chabahar in Iran. Saif al-Adl was in Zahedan, and then he moved to Tehran. And many of the other leaders ended up under the protection of Qasim Soleimani himself. And their entire focus, even though al-Qaeda was fighting Iran and Iraq, yet al-Qaeda in Iran was fighting alongside Iran against Saudi Arabia and trying to destabilize the Saudi royal family. That has happened between 2002 until 2006. There is a brilliant documentary, called The Path of Blood. It's available on Apple TV. This is where you will see how it was an entire war. It was warfare between al-Qaeda and the Saudi authorities for 4 years. And I think this was mostly funded and directed from al-Qaeda operatives based out of Iran and supported by Iran. Because at the end of the day, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is how now the Houthis started to apply this Iranian textbook strategy, and they started the process of supplying al-Qaeda in Yemen with whatever they need in order to create that chaos and to make it difficult for the Yemeni government. Because at the moment, based on the truce between the Houthis and the Saudi government, the Houthis are not going to attack Ma'rib, they are not going to attack Aden, and so they relegated that task to a third party. And this is one of the reasons why I always argued that Iran cannot be trusted to be a nuclear power, because of the presence and because of the founding, establishing, nurturing, training, and funding of so many proxies that you never know if they are going to build a device, modify it for land detonation, and then hand it over to one of these terrorist groups, especially if it's a Sunni one, and then they say, go and do with it whatever you want. Because at the end of the day, it is deniable. It's not my material, it's not my bomb. And I think this is why it is important to understand that the Middle East is truly, truly the battleground between the nation state, the modern nation state as a concept and institution, and the non-state actors that are there. And just to show you how the cancer of non-state actors is so prevalent in the Middle East, how could it be that the Iranian army standing is about 600,000? That's within Iran. But they have a standing 700,000 fighters fighting under their banner outside of their border. They are Iraqis in the militias. Hezbollah alone have 100,000. The Houthis have 300,000. So the question is, how could there be this massive number of people under arms fighting for them, and all under the banners of non-state actors, states within a state? And also at the same time, to make it even more bizarre, is the fact that these groups, some of them, like the Houthis, possess weapons with long-range offensive capability exceeding 2,000 kilometers. That is more than what the armies of Egypt and Turkey possess. And Turkey is a NATO member. They don't have anything that can reach beyond 2,000 kilometers.
And then finally, Chairman, the Houthis, we are sure that are being funded as a proxy from Iran. What about in Afghanistan and in Yemen with al-Qaeda? Are they being funded directly? ISIS in Afghanistan and al-Qaeda in Yemen. Are they being funded directly, or are they being funded indirectly, or has Iran got nothing to do with that?
For ISIS, it's a separate issue, because after the fall of ISIS in 2019, and when their last territory was taken over and extinguished, their cash wasn't recovered, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars of it. And there was a question, what happened to that cash? So that cash most likely moved to Turkey, and this is where it was converted, invested, and became the feeding or the seed money for other cells, including in Afghanistan. It is no coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we start to see a resurgence of ISIS in Afghanistan just when the Taliban started to have direct hawala, more semi-official hawala banking with Turkey.
Thank you. Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you about the Daesh detention camps in northeast Syria? Do you think the UK pays enough attention to what's going on in those camps, or have we kind of less seen, quick as forgotten attitude?
Some of these people are kids, and some of them will grow, to become even more resentful and vengeful. And the question is, it's better that they are under control, even if it is in prison here, than for them to be on the loose out there without having any degree of control. And this is why I think, and this is something I floated in 2019 when I said that maybe the UK sovereign base in Cyprus could play an important role in terms of having a detention center there and processing their cases and passing sentences in terms of establishing a court in order to try them, because leaving them there indefinitely is going to create that uncertainty which could have an indefinite danger down the line. Mm-hmm. So they need to be under control somehow.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you saw, there was a fascinating series of reports from Alex Crawford on Sky News, and she painted a pretty terrifying picture of the women and children detention camps, and basically it's a breeding ground for a new generation of radicals. Do you think that the UK and the West generally is sufficiently robust in tackling what's going on in those camps, or have they essentially left it to the Kurds to guard and control and hope for the best?
I think, unfortunately, the fact that all of them are gathered in one single camp, and that camp will become, unfortunately, a breeding ground of radicalism, of extremism. There are already people who seen enough death and trauma. So instead of trying to first, confront their radicalism and then rehabilitate them, unfortunately, they are left to their devices in order to become more resentful, more vengeful in the future without any control. And this is why I'm stressing. The fact that they are out there with minimum control is what worries me.
And I'm asking, forgive me, I'm going to ask you to generalise here, but what would be the general view of the public in the region about those being held in the camps in Syria? Would they be sympathetic, supportive, apathetic, indifferent? What is that general opinion, and have you noticed a shift at all?
It depends who you ask, but generally ISIS is a toxic legacy right now in most of the population of the Middle East, especially after what they've done and the atrocities they committed. I think yet most of these women and children are viewed as the unfortunate, idiotic people who just ended up in the wrong place. Some of them are viewed with suspicion that they came on their own volition. It's just the sympathy more is reserved for the children who were children at the time of the fall of the ISIS territories.
Thank you.
Final two questions from me, because I'm afraid we have to wrap up. But just on that point about de-radicalisation, I'm often considered to be quite an extreme view on de-radicalisation, which is I don't think you can de-radicalise people, because I think the psychological drivers remain there. You can just redirect it or refocus it to a different area of obsession and focus. So given that we spend a lot of time being told that we should take back all these people to the UK, and particularly children, anyone under 18, allow them to live in society freely, where do you think we sit on that in terms of being able to de-radicalise people? And then finally, just what you think, this is a very different question, but what would be the biggest change you would make to either UK foreign policy or to our approach towards counter-terrorism that you think would meaningfully make us safer from the risk from terrorism?
In terms of de-radicalization, I never really agreed with it, because I agree with the term rehabilitation, because I think this is the best approach. Counter-violent extremism, de-radicalization, I always find it to be unhelpful, because it already carries a stigma. Like, I mean, the idea is that you have to confront, the problem head on to say, you are on the wrong path. Being member of this group is equivalent of being a member of, a gang or a drug circle or anything like that. So, you need to get out of that. And therefore, the question is, how do we do rehabilitation? So it's not about de-radicalization. It's about taking away the violence, and the driver towards violence from the person in order for them to function normally or semi-normally within a society. That's the best you can hope for. And then within time, you hope that the seeds of doubt that you sow in their minds will grow enough in order to make them think critically about the path they have taken before and how they can do what they need to do, which is a U-turn. As for the UK foreign policy, it is my view, and this is just personal view, that the UK should conduct its foreign policy according to the interests of the UK and its people. It shouldn't be dictated by any loud voices from any minority. And this is why, I think this is where the nation state asserts its authority, asserts its entitlement to set the policy according to the mandate in which they were elected. And this is how, the government should behave with, any dissenting voices, is that, look, I'm the elected government. I decide what foreign policy is the best for the UK and its population. You can disagree, no problem. You can take a megaphone and shout all you want. But if you step out of the line and use violence in order to assert your point, this is when things will be different. And the same thing with incitement to violence.
So to be clear, you're making a distinction because you're not suggesting that you're functioning semi-normally. You're rehabilitated, right? So you're not suggesting it's impossible for some. What you're suggesting is that those who've committed violent acts should be treated differently to those who have not.
Those with blood on their hands, I don't think they should be treated exactly as those who, thank God, basically I never had any blood on my hand. So basically this is, I think, where those who got out early are not the same as those who got out too late. So there has to be always a case by case. So rehabilitation works according to the needs of the individual. Some individuals went too deep, and some individuals just realized that they were in the wrong path early on and did a U-turn at the right time.
Some might equally have had the will to shed blood on their hands but not had the opportunity, and that's the challenge. Thank you ever so much for your time. I'm going to suspend this session briefly. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Welcome back to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we're very pleased to be joined by Professor Evans. Professor Evans, can you kindly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair. So my name is Alexander Evans. I'm a professor in practice in public policy at the London School of Economics. I've also been a career diplomat for 21 years. I need to emphasise that I'm still a diplomat on sabbatical, so I'm not speaking on behalf of government at all. And I think relevant to this inquiry, I'm a former coordinator of the al-Qaeda, Daesh, Taliban monitoring team of the United Nations Security Council, and I think you've heard from two of my erstwhile colleagues as well in previous sessions.
Yeah, thank you. Can you give us an overview of the current state of Daesh Khorasan and essentially what threat it poses to the UK and our interests?
So I should begin by saying I don't track it as closely as I would have in that United Nations avatar, but I still think there is an active threat to the United Kingdom, both to Homeland Security and to UK nationals overseas, from Daesh and its international networks, and indeed from al-Qaeda and affiliates globally. And that's something we shouldn't lose sight of.
Thank you. And in terms of the relationship between Daesh and Daesh, Khorasan and the Taliban, can you unpack that for us slightly?
Well, I think when we peer into Afghanistan, it's a complex terrain. So it's tempting to reduce Afghanistan to sort of one amalgam of terrorist groups and organisations. But actually, I think you even prior to the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, you had a differentiated set of organisations operating in Afghanistan. You even had differentiated factions within the Taliban itself. So you essentially now have a Daesh faction in Afghanistan that is in opposition to the Taliban regime, but also in affiliation with elements in al-Qaeda, but also other regional groups. And Jamaat Ansarullah, a group operating in Tajikistan, is one that should be mentioned in this regard.
Is the Taliban actively working to defeat Daesh Khorasan, and do you see that being as a likelihood? Do they have the capability or the will?
Do they have the capability? I think that's questionable, because I think trying to assert governance in Afghanistan was a difficult task at any moment in recent decades, regardless of the flavour of government that was in control. Do they have a will? I think they certainly have a will not to be challenged by Daesh elements or indeed other armed groups in Afghanistan. But I think the nature of Taliban capability in the country means that exercising that will is more challenging than trying to desire to exercise that will.
Thank you. And just before I bring in Fabian, you were here for the last evidence session when we heard the view that if the previous king of Afghanistan had essentially been brought back and a monarchy being re-established, you spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and a lot of time getting to know tribes also across the border. Do you think there's any likelihood that that was actually possible? It would have helped stabilise and bring back that governance that you say is so hard?
I would perhaps offer a slightly more sceptical air about, sort of post 9/11 futures. I worked in Afghanistan for UNAMA before I joined the Foreign Office in early 2002. A side comment on expertise on the area, the fact that I'd worked in Kashmir and Pakistan was considered to be good enough to be hard on a Tuesday and in Kabul on the Sunday. So there is a lesson here about longitudinal expertise in government. But I wonder how much a restoration of the monarchy would have been sufficient to restore consensus and political harmony in Afghanistan. I do think, but I don't, it's one of the what-ifs. I think had Abdul Haq, one of the Mujahideen leaders, not been murdered when he returned to Afghanistan, might he have played a role in bridging in a different way? Possibly. But I think that's for historians and regional experts to debate in future rather than for us to be confident would be true.
Sorry, one more final question, just some evidence we've heard over the last few weeks. We had a former head of MI6 in here saying that we don't seem to have learnt the lessons that you cannot bring a military solution to a political problem. Do you think that leads to a lot of the problems we're currently seeing in Afghanistan and potentially other theatres as well?
My view in Afghanistan, at least, was ultimately one needed to pursue a political settlement. I think you can't always achieve a political settlement, and it's got to be a political settlement that respects the red lines you have as a nation and as a like-minded democratic community. But that doesn't absent the need for force or the need for coercion, and I think as the negotiation specialists say, the ZOPA. Academics of course love acronyms, just like bureaucrats. The ZOPA is the zone of possible agreement, right? So if you're looking for a ZOPA in an international conflict or in a national conflict, you have to be confident that there is actually a common terrain which would be at least minimally acceptable to all parties. I think the challenge often with terrorist groups is there is not an acceptable ZOPA to reach.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Evans, can I move us to Central Asia to look at the threats coming from there? I wondered how seriously you considered the threat of terrorism to be in places like Tajikistan and some of the other Caucasus nations, and how serious is the threat overall emanating from Central Asia, certainly with respect to the nationals of those countries who partake in terror attacks or become foreign fighters?
So if I may, I think I would sort of distinguish between the threat posed to Central Asian states by those networks and groups and the threat posed to the UK homeland from those groups. I think the threat posed to the UK homeland is relatively slim, but I think the threat posed to potentially to UK nationals elsewhere is not absent. And the threat posed to countries like Tajikistan is real. Although, again, the security services in most countries have generally been fairly effective at identifying and containing threats within those countries from those groups.
Is that because sorry to interrupt you, is that because they're a hangover from Soviet times and they still have the infrastructure of the Soviet mechanism for repression?
At times, I think they also get quite a lot of external assistance from regional actors, be it from the Chinese or indeed from the Russian Federation. But I think it's also that many of the actors and networks, for example, with Tajik groups or with Uzbek groups, are present in Afghanistan or they're present in Syria and Iraq, rather than actually present in Central Asia. So the operating terrain in Central Asia has not been very easy one for some of these groups. The Fergana Valley, which was an anchor for some of these groups in the 1990s, became less permissive for them. And so you see basically this networking and operating and training in diaspora in both those places, particularly the Middle East and particularly Afghanistan. And you also see a focus on trying to conduct attacks in Moscow, and we saw that very sadly in recent weeks.
Is there any particular one of the republics that stands out over and above the others for its contribution towards terrorist activities in terms of its population?
In terms of its population, I think Uzbekistan generally has been probably the chief. Uzbek nationals were one of the most predominant groupings within the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. The Tajik elements have generally been affiliated with this group, Jamaat Ansarullah. I mean, again, the last time I looked at it, low hundreds, mainly based in the east of the country in Gorno-Badakhshan. But again, many of those individuals are based elsewhere. It's an interesting counterpoint to this argument that organised crime always ties up with terrorism, because for many of the smuggling networks that smuggle, in particular, narcotics in eastern Tajikistan, it's not in their business interest to maintain ties with terrorist groups. They're interested in getting their product through that terrain. So sometimes there is a lack of confluence of interest between these organised crime groups and terrorist groups.
Very much.
And on that, do you think when it comes to our approach to areas where we see vast amounts of terrorism within a country, are we doing enough on the governance and capacity building and essentially political settlement side? Or do you think we create a space for political settlements where political teams run around, do a lot of very hard work, but essentially if we can't get the ZOPA, as you call it, essentially if there's no real room for agreement, that essentially we let CT take over and we kind of drop the political settlement and government's work to one side? Yes, capacity building might continue, helping a host government improve its armed forces, but do you think we essentially can only throw one ball in the air at once and we're either going for political settlements or we see it as a CT operation, or do you think that's slightly unfair?
Well, I think there's a wider longitudinal piece here about joined up government. Whatever you call it, whether you ascribe to sort of Mark Sebel's fusion doctrine or whatever nomenclature, integration, I think, is the name of the day in recent years in the British government. But there is a marked step change. If we think about the history of the UK and international counter-terrorism, actually the Foreign Office really developed a capability in the 1960s and 70s. It was still relatively niche as late as the mid-1990s, and it's only really been after 9/11 that it acquired the cadence and the resourcing and the cross-government footprint that it now has today. A big lesson of that was integration across government. In the 1960s and 70s, it was about dealing in particular with aircraft hijackings. So joint work internationally through the International Civil Aviation Organization, joining up with airlines, joining up internationally, because you're talking about point-to-point with airport security, was really important. After 9/11, I think it was the ability to try to fuse development and diplomacy and justice and the security and intelligence services, along with sort of political work by diplomats. If I may, I'll offer a brief anecdote on this. When I worked in Pakistan in 2007 to 2009, we were sent a prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service who joined us, who's now sadly deceased. And the cultures of integration across government took time. In this particular case, he persuaded us by being a very excellent cocktail maker, by virtue of having been a cocktail waiter in Newcastle in a previous avatar. But more importantly, he was someone who was very critical to ensuring successful, sustained prosecutions in the UK. So once you have integration proving its worth in terms of carry through to prevention, disruption, prosecutions, I think people take it on board. Trying to get that integration right, I'm not claiming that in the British government it's perfect, but I would argue that it's a lot better than it was 20, 25 years ago. And in many of the other governments I've visited and worked with, I think they still struggle with that. Police officers don't talk to intelligence services. Intelligence services don't deign to talk to police officers. Data sharing between government agencies is very difficult. And institutional cultures, and indeed cultures of accountability and authority, inhibit that data sharing and coordination within government that's so crucial at home as well as overseas.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Professor Evans. You've talked a bit about the crossover within government. How effectively do you think the FCDO has exerted its influence on these counter-terrorism policies bilaterally and multilaterally in recent years?
Well, not trying to be facetious about it, but obviously I think that we are in a world where sovereignty matters to most states. And so I think states will ultimately make sovereign decisions about their national security policy, including around counter-terrorism. I think the UK can bring to bear influence and insight and information sharing, and it does in many different spaces. I would perhaps talk more about the UN and multilateral architecture, where I think the UK has been a credible accelerant of international coordination and cooperation. And partly because I think the UK has been willing to talk in private, as well as sometimes in public, about the failures and the challenges of that integration, as well as about the successes. So it hasn't just been the UK on transmit about here are the ways in which we've done this well, or here are the ways in which we've achieved success, but it's also been a recognition about how difficult it is to get this integrated culture within government, but also integrated coordination and cooperation internationally, particularly when you're talking about states that do not share good bilateral relations. So it's one thing for the UK to coordinate with like-minded states or states with which it has relatively good bilateral relations. It's quite another thing to achieve coordination between two warring states or sparring states in the international system. And that I think is where regional organisations and where the UN system can sometimes play a useful role.
Can you tell us a bit more about where you think the UK needs to strengthen those bilateral relationships? Where should we look to build closer relationships, perhaps where we don't currently have them?
Again, I think I might pause, given my still suspended animation, government identity. But if I may, what I would say is this: I think there's always a trade-off between the now and the next. There is a delicious Norwegian word, tidsklemmer, which means time squeeze. It's a description of a parent of an under 5-year-old. I'm sure various committee members will recognise that in their at different stages in their life. I have an 8-week-old baby at the moment. Time squeeze applies to most government policy making, including national security policy making. One of the challenges of the time pressures and the crisis pressures on national security policy making is you focus on the immediate crisis now and the immediate threat reporting now, rather than think prospectively about where threat might come from in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years' time. And so I think there is a really powerful argument here, and it's difficult to do in a tightly resourced environment, for how do you maintain multiple relationships with almost every state on the planet, including the states where actually that might not be an immediate priority, it might not even be a middle-level priority. So we can all do the matrices where we measure the states that matter most against the current threat environment or against the current structures of transnational structures of al-Qaeda or Daesh affiliates. But just as with foreign policy making, there is, I think, a powerful argument for an insurance approach to it. And an insurance approach is you have as wide area network as possible, and you have relations with as many different states and actors as possible. Because actually, one constant element of foreign policy, which is also one constant element of counter-terrorism and national security policy making, is surprise.
I think the fact that we're moving in the direction of a multipolar geopolitical environment is making this even more challenging?
I think one aspect of that multipolarity makes it even more challenging, which is a growing distrust internationally, growing hedging, a greater willingness to use hybrid policies overseas for a range of states, particularly hostile states to the UK, which I think encourages potentially the bad behaviours of supporting proxies or supporting terrorist groups for some states, but it also inhibits the trust that is necessary to sharing information. One of, I think, the huge gains of the international campaign, both against al-Qaeda and against Daesh, was the growth of an architecture of international information sharing. And you can see that in multiple different aspects. Sharing biometric data on citizens and their travel. The introduction of a global exit control regime so that we're measured when we exit a country as well as when we enter. Crucial for tracking and disrupting foreign terrorist fighters. But also the willingness to find vehicles, whether it's Interpol or bilateral mechanisms or through European mechanisms or through other like-minded mechanisms, to share advanced threat intelligence and indeed to publish that information externally. So that the greater use of travel advisories to warn citizens, not just of the UK, but to provide shared environments to help shape risk decisions by citizens, has all been a massive plus. That is, I think, at risk in some ways in an international environment where trust is reducing, not increasing. And that will almost inevitably have an effect on counter-terrorism information sharing as well, despite the fact that when I worked for the UN Security Council, counter-terrorism was one of the very few spaces where Russia, China, France, the US and the UK were still able to find common ground, and it was still possible to find common ground between authoritarian states and democratic states, with two health warnings. One was obviously human rights compliance, where the temptation to mistreat detainees and to not treat citizens with the same norms that we would behave with was evident in many states. And the other was the temptation to misattribute domestic political opponents as terrorists. So there were a number of occasions when I'd have discrete conversations with member states of the UN who wanted to sanction their political opponents, and I had to gently explain that the likelihood of getting that through the UN Security Council was low.
Thank you very much.
Fabian.
Can I just, Professor Evans, just ask you how you think the increasing tendency for state-sponsored terrorism that we're seeing today, how that undermines this sort of multilateral approach towards curbing terrorism worldwide? There's a complete contradiction, isn't there?
There is a contradiction there, and I'm not saying it's a massive growing tendency across all states, but I think that the risk appetite is growing amongst certain states, and that growing risk appetite has then a secondary effect on other states as well. So I do think that's something of concern. Does it fundamentally destroy the fabric of international cooperation, coordination, standards, sanctions on counter-terrorism? No. Does it undermine, though, the credibility of those regimes? Yes, it does. And there is a challenge there. If you are a state that covertly supports terrorist groups, your likelihood to invest heavily and robustly in the architecture of counter-terrorism internationally is perhaps somewhat reduced. You don't want to expose yourself to embarrassment or to charges of hypocrisy.
Thank you very much for that. Can I move on to a question about the UK's influence in multilateral organisations concerned with countering terrorism, and that is the merger of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with the Department for International Development. Do you think it has influenced our ability to be considered a leading actor in this area? or indeed to be a leading actor in the area?
Again, ordinarily, I would demur from answering it, given I'm still still in the service. But actually, on this one, I would also say I don't think it's material actually to it. I think the integration. I would again speak to this integration of insight across government, and I think there's a really important insight that's gained from development as well as from diplomacy. And I'll give a practical example relating to counter-terrorist finance. If you want to understand informal remittance flows, Hawala and Hundi systems, actually the people with the greatest expertise on that are the development community. It's looking at remittance flows, it's looking at micropayments internationally. But that's also relevant for understanding the peer-to-peer funding that supports terrorist organisations. So I think that's one example of where insight from the field of development can be very helpful to the world of national security, but also vice versa. And so you actually have the ability to have a constructive dialogue and debate, which hopefully leads to better policy making.
I mean, which issues relating to terrorism do you think the UK could contribute more effectively to in the international fora? For example, the repatriation of British nationals from the camps in northeast Syria, which we've already discussed today. I mean, how else could we help contribute more effectively within the international forum?
So let me pick one issue that was certainly on the UN Security, or has been on the UN Security Council's agenda for some time, which is kidnap for ransom payments to terrorist organisations. So at one level, a lot of terrorism is relatively inexpensive, notwithstanding the capital that is accrued to Daesh through Daesh's temporary control over lots of territory and resource in Iraq and Syria. Many terrorist organisations operate on budgets that would, probably not match the expense accounts of many people in public servants, and certainly would fall below the threshold for suspicious transaction reporting in the counter-terrorist and anti-money laundering frameworks internationally. If you have large payments of multiple millions of dollars for hostages, where that money is accruing to an al-Qaeda affiliate or to a Daesh affiliate, that is really material to increasing the risk to all citizens elsewhere. So I think kidnap for ransom, both publicising the threat of it and also trying to encourage and foster greater action on it has been a helpful role, not just for the UN Security Council, but I think the UK has played a leadership role within that for some years.
And indeed so have the Americans, because they have a particularly dedicated official to kidnap for ransom issues and crimes.
They do, and I think the US and the UK have been, it's a particular area of robust Anglo-American coordination on that policy agenda. But it is also an area again where the UN Security Council has passed a Security Council resolution, against the practice. The practice does still continue in some instances with some states. And it's that trade-off, I think, sometimes it's politically very difficult for states, including some democracies, which is what you do now to protect and secure your citizens versus what is the effect of that policy action later on. And kidnap for ransom payments to terrorist organisations is a classic case in point where what you do now generally generates greater threat to your citizens later on.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Can I just, last point, Chair, in your assessment, do you think sanctions are an effective tool with which to counter terrorism, both nationally and the multilateral level, or are they a very blunt instrument?
I think targeted sanctions can be an effective tool of disruption and of messaging, delegitimization as well, and ideally of deterrence. But I think it's important not to overemphasize what targeted sanctions can achieve. And I would particularly take here travel bans and asset freezes. It's tempting to think, well, actually, this doesn't really make much difference. If you, for example, Osama bin Laden used to be on the UN Security Council sanctions list. One suspects that didn't necessarily have that much effect on him. But if you can disrupt, for example, financiers linked to Daesh or the Taliban or to al-Qaeda, and it becomes more difficult for those people to move across borders or to use the formal banking system, that actually can have a disruptive effect on those organisations. So sometimes I think temptation with sanctions is to focus on the level ones, the leaders of organisations, rather than focusing in on where are targeted sanctions impacting on the fundraisers, if you like, the equivalent of party agents. Yeah? If you disrupt a party agent for an MP, you potentially have quite a significant effect on their local operations and their electoral campaigns. People will tend to know who the MP is. They're not necessarily going to know who the party agent is. So a bit of it is how do you then focus in on the nodal points in networks that will be most influential. The other argument I think is sometimes used against targeted sanctions is, does it really have much effect if you're talking about a cash economy, if you're talking about reaching into parts of Yemen or parts of Somalia, for example, or parts of Afghanistan? But even there it can have a chilling effect in a positive way. Let me give an example. So if you are somebody engaging in financial investment in Somalia or Afghanistan, sometimes what you do to reduce your risk as you invest is you get co-investments from people from other groups around you in your area. If you are the subject of sanctions, you may have no bank account that is materially affected. You may not be using Western Union or Wise or any other money service business to move money overseas. But you do need the co-investment by your peers to invest in whatever business you want to invest in Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan. And if you are sanctioned, those peers may well have a legitimate business or a banking or the use of formal banking elsewhere. So suddenly you'll find yourself, your other business activities, particularly if you're a financier, can be affected. So for those who are cynical about the reach of targeted sanctions, I would counterpose with the fact that I think often on the financial tool, sometimes it can have actually greater disruptive effect than people think. But it is important to see it only it's one element in a suite of tools that can be used. I would also pause and just talk about the importance of the travel ban and of the deterrent effect. On the travel ban, fine, you may not be able to stop somebody crossing a border between, taking a boat between Yemen and East Africa, but you can stop them getting on a plane. And the world of biometrics today makes it very difficult. The days of masquerading under multiple identities are gone when it comes to movement by aviation or movement across any border that's secured by biometrics. So again, the fact that sanctions lists have gone from an analog sanctions list, literally a list of names and addresses, to a much more digital framework with biometrics where possible, allied to Interpol red notices. So the ability to exercise the Interpol system, linked into screening systems in airports, screening systems on entry and exit from countries, disrupts the travel plans, again, of financiers or level 2s or level 3s. Finally, on the deterrent effect, if I may, I do think there is something that many of these groups crave, which is legitimacy. And if they're not seen as equal legitimate actors to states, if they're seen as being beyond reasonableness by the international state community, I think that's important. It's an important message in multiple ways as well.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Evans. Could I ask you about the rising polarization internationally, and is there a risk with that countries and regions start to tackle terrorism and counter-terrorism themselves rather than using existing multilateral agencies?
Yes, I think there is a risk, but I think that's offset somewhat by the value that people have seen from, for example, some of the sharing of advanced passenger information or some of the sharing of red notices via Interpol mechanisms on individuals of concern. So can some of these systems be misused by government? They certainly can. So the risk is, do you get dissidents put on there? Do you get certain countries overusing these mechanisms for domestic political purposes, in particular if they are authoritarian countries and wish to inhibit the civil rights of their citizens or indeed of opponents elsewhere? So I think the benefits of this international architecture of data sharing and of advanced sharing about threats probably mean that there will still be the use of it by all states. But I think where there are particular breakdowns in trust, what we will see is the loss of that bilateral connectivity between states. So even for states that have often had very difficult bilateral relations, When it comes to a threat by terrorists to kill innocent civilians in a city or a public event in that country, information will still be shared. And I would point to the public advisory that was issued about the threat in Moscow. That I think is an example of that in practice. There is a commitment, I think, to protecting civilians that exists in many of the counter-terrorism units across the world and in the sort of bureaucracies around government on those. The question I would have is, to what extent do geopolitical frictions, which is not about multipolarity per se, it's about actually poor bilateral relations between states, to what extent does that then inhibit the sharing amongst experts, or the sharing between services, or the sharing between police forces of information that would be material to preventing terrorist attacks that kill civilians?
Can I move on to the UN Security Council and what reform we could or should see of that organisation to help protect the stability in the Middle East? And in your assessment, which country or countries perhaps should be given a permanent seat on the Security Council?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a wonderful question. I would sort of describe it roughly as the same question as, who should I invite to my 50th birthday party? It's a question that seems easy to answer until you start listing the names on a sheet of paper and work out that your venue has space for 30, but you have 50 people you'd like to invite, 20 of whom will be offended if they don't receive an invitation. So there are, of course, a range of credible candidates. I think it is important to signal that the UK was the first P5 member. This is often forgotten. The UK was the first P5 member to publicly endorse India's bid for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council in early 2002. And that is something that was very important in my time as a diplomat in India. But I think it is important to recognise that the UK was a first mover on that amongst UN Security Council members. But that balance between efficacy of having a small council that can reach decisions speedily, how and where that use of veto is exercised, with the balance of representation across the UN system, is a delicate one. Self-evidently, the UN Security Council needs reform. How that reform should be manifested and who should end up on the council is, I think, a trickier question, and that's where so much of international debate has lain of late. But I do think it's important to note, and this is perhaps pulling back to the multipolar operating environment we're in now, it's tempting sometimes, if you're sitting in the Security Council, to think that we live in a world of 15, where 5 may be slightly more equal than 10. Yeah? We don't. We live in a world of 193. And many of the frameworks which would shape counter-terrorism and indeed much other international policy, if we're thinking about the regulation of or international agreements or standards around technology, they're made amongst 193 countries, not amongst 15. So one of the challenges, I think, for UK influence and engagement internationally is that relationship, again, with 193 is important, not just the membership of the 15.
I suppose some might argue that you wouldn't have 193, but at the same time you might have more regional representation. So, for example, it's not my view; it's just something that I've read. Some people think that perhaps Saudi Arabia, as the region's leading light, if you like, might be one of those countries that you would be considered to be given Security Council membership. Do you have a view on that, especially with the Middle East being what it is at the moment?
As I said, individual candidacies pull me back into birthday party terrain.
At least you haven't said you were going to cancel your birthday party.
That's true. It's going to be a virtual event, obviously. But, it's already passed. But I think I'd pull back and say, look, I think there is a legitimate debate to say, can you really have a continent without recognition, or a significant grouping within the international system without representation? There is, of course, representation through elected members, the E10 of the Security Council, but that is materially different to being a permanent member of the Security Council. I think on counter-terrorism, it's important to recognise that there is this balance between Security Council mechanisms and General Assembly mechanisms, The General Assembly activity on counterterrorism is really important if we're thinking about prevent and de-radicalization, some of the capacity building issues internationally, the funding mechanisms for capacity building and support, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime work, the UN Office of Counterterrorism work. The Security Council plays this crucially important role, I think, around the sanctions regime, the Chapter 7 capabilities of the Security Council. But also, I would argue, an unsung but a hugely important part of the international counterterrorism machinery is the 1540 Committee of Experts working for the UN Security Council. This is the committee of experts that look at chemical, biological, nuclear and radiological risk linked to terrorist groups. They do extraordinarily valuable work. It's important work. It is in some ways viewed as a technical backwater, but I think with the rapid onset growth of technology and the ability that to learn things today can be done at a pace using access to the internet, the access to grey literature, that could not be done 10 or 15 years ago. And there is a worrying question there about that. You add in the ability of generative AI, and I realise everybody has to, for marketing purposes, mention AI at every meeting nowadays. But out with that marketing pitch, the risk of accelerated capabilities within terrorist groups is something that I think should be a concern for us. And it's a very different world to worrying about toxins or CBRN used by groups in the 1990s when I first worked on it. My academic background was doing a PhD on some groups in Pakistan. So that concern, again, leads us back to the 193, because actually the mechanisms for international regulation, there may be bilateral mechanisms, there may be European mechanisms. There are obviously things that the UK nationally will do and will do with like-minded partners. But actually an international architecture on that is important to encompass all states. The 1540 Committee is the anchor of resource and expertise in the UN system on that, and it deserves support.
We look back to when I was a kid and terrorism was fertilizer and shoeboxes in Northern Ireland, and now it's drones, it's cruise missiles. The Houthis are prescribed, and they've got some significant kit available to them. Where do you see, I mean, it's a bit of a crystal ball. I know we're talking about AI, and everyone has to. It's almost like we didn't talk about that, 2 years ago. Now that's the only game in town, and we didn't see it coming. So where do you see the UN and other multilaterals in 5 or 10 years' time trying to be ahead of that? I mean, we're talking about things we already know and having to deal with those, but be ahead of that, to counter terrorism in the future.
Look, I have a particular preoccupation with long-range policy making. I teach anticipatory policy making at the LSE. I also teach technology, data science, and policy making, and including around national security and counter-terrorism. Again, it's this problem that for governments and for international organisations, the temptation is to do now rather than next. And next is often the optionality. That's the thing that gets deprioritised against the super prioritisation of what we're dealing with now. I think the UN can play a useful role in some of that blended analysis from all states. The UN can talk to the Sudanese and the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, as well as talk to the Israelis, the Americans, ourselves, and the French. So the ability to talk to everybody is a particular, and I would argue largely unique capability of the UN, particularly of these UN Security Council expert groups. I would hope that the UK government, as with other governments, is in a position where whatever might be said in strategy documents, and I think sometimes it's tempting to get over-obsessed with how many lines are mentioned in a particular government strategy document about counter-terrorism over some other subject. I think there's something really material here about how much capacity within government is dedicated to two things. One, anticipation. So how much have you got people thinking about where might the threat go next? What does it mean around UAVs? What do we think about the future of toxins and terrorist groups? What are some of the implications of new technologies around that? But also, how do you then factor in not just that long-range thinking about what next, but the insurance policy of making sure that we have enough insight on a Tajikistan or the Maldives or Panama, as well as on the more obvious countries and issues that we might prioritise and look at. And I think one of the perennial challenges of government is how to do next as well as now, and how to build that in, not just to resilience planning and resilience in counter-terrorism, but also how do you build that into strategic policy making. So it's not just have you got a group of people working on this in DSTL or in FCDO, but to what extent is this ventilated and aired at senior official level, at permanent secretary or director general level, but also at ministerial level? Because again, that's the subject that always gets squeezed out of every committee meeting.
And do we have then, do we have the bandwidth? I was talking about Yemen earlier because that's an example, and to Mr. Dean, who said that, it was sort of obvious to him that while the Houthis are in negotiations with the Saudis to try and the UN for the roadmap to peace, they're now devolving the attacks on the southern lot to al-Qaeda. Do we, I don't know, the multilaterals as well as the UK, do we have the bandwidth to see these things coming? And you were saying, about look beyond now. It doesn't look like we are doing that. So I wonder, with a penholder in Yemen, for example, and yet we didn't see most of what has happened, even with the Houthis in the Red Sea, and now with al-Qaeda being, resurgent in Yemen again. Do we have the bandwidth to see it? Is that the problem?
Well, can I answer that by dividing it into two? I think there's one element here, which is, do we often get things wrong? Yes, of course. Do all governments often get things wrong? Yes, of course, because our ability to predict the future, strangely, hasn't yet reached sort of AI avatar standards. So I think we the ability to look forward doesn't guarantee the ability to accurately predict. There have been improvements in British weather forecasting. We now can have the same confidence about weather forecasting for twice the length of period that we used to have, I think, 20 or 30 years ago. Certainly, given weather in April and in early May, there's no guarantee that weather forecasting is concurrent with the ability to predict whether you need an umbrella or not in London, for example. So I wouldn't necessarily hold us too harshly to account for not being able to predict all the time. Insight and expertise doesn't always lead to predictive capability. I think that question of bandwidth, however, is a really important one. And to what extent is there senior level bandwidth? To be fair on government, all governments and all international organisations, you can't do everything everywhere all at once. It's just not possible. There's only so much time in the day, there's only so much attention time or red box time or committee time to attend to different issues. But I think this is where having a wide area network diplomatically, internationally, is really important. It is where, and this is not a plea for academic expertise necessarily, but it's where expertise on countries and languages and groups becomes very important. I learned an awful lot in the 1990s by sitting at the feet of somebody who'd been in the diplomatic service in the 1980s and who'd be given a nearly 2-year leave of absence to go and study Islamist groups around the world. As a visiting student at SOAS. But that requires the redundancy to allow somebody to go off and spend 2 years to learn about that. And I would argue that was really material to UK interests to have somebody who's an expert on Islamist movements everywhere from Indonesia to Nigeria. But it takes a degree of redundancy. There is a risk, I would argue, for the UK PLC on counter-terrorism, which is, on the one hand, we have, and you met many of these experts in recent evidence sessions, we have an extraordinary group of terrorism experts from St Andrews to King's College London. I think Professor Peter Neumann gave evidence to you, Antonio Guizzotti and others. That's good news. But we have far fewer people today who spent time on the ground among Islamist groups doing that kind of anthropological field work. Because actually, after 9/11, that became very dangerous and difficult to do. So I spent a chunk of my time as a PhD student in the 1990s interviewing members of terrorist organisations. Now, I couldn't get that, frankly, for a risk committee nowadays in university, probably rightly so. But also the risk environment has shifted very fundamentally, that you can't necessarily do that kind of fieldwork anymore. So I would argue that one of the risks we have as the UK, which is also true for other peer nations, is we have a reduced capability within academia, but it gives you that really granular on-the-ground understanding of what does political Islam look like in country X, what does radical right-wing terrorism or radical nihilist terrorism look like in this university environment, for example, because we have fewer people who've done that experiential, ethnographic, on-the-ground fieldwork with languages in high-risk environments. And that, so on the one hand, we have more insight. On the other hand, we have less. And that should concern us. If we're thinking about blinking forward to try and understand the future, do we have the expertise and insight, not necessarily just within the stovepipe of His Majesty's government, but do we have that within UK PLC? I would argue the jury's out on some of the expertise we might require.
Is there, we're sort of our own worst enemy in some ways. So, for example, parts of government will, in Africa, where we won't sign any export guarantees if it includes fossilised fuels, for example. And so British businesses don't bid for business over there. They don't know if they can trust some of the governments to pay. They'd need to have some sort of support from the government in order to give them the comfort to go and do that. But while they're moving out and the Chinese and Russians are moving in because they don't have the same set of values as we do, that's the British, not the establishment necessarily, but British businesses and others moving out. Are we losing that, I'm talking about bandwidth, but are we losing that sort of general, more so than just the academia and, language specialists and the rest? Are we just losing that by vacating these spaces and allowing, our adversaries, to all intents and purposes, to come and fill the vacuum that we leave?
Look, I mean, my expertise isn't on sort of trade diplomacy, so I couldn't really talk about sort of export guarantees and the impact on, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises in the UK. But thinking about the UK presence overseas, what do we benefit from? We benefit from the fact we have a huge UK diaspora globally. We don't even know exactly the number, but we've got something like 6 million Brits live beyond our borders. We have more Britons living in the Indo-Pacific than France has. French citizens, which is a hardy reminder when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, or certainly we're on a par. So I agree with you. British business people overseas, people working for NGOs overseas, British teachers overseas, British retirees and residents overseas are part of that plethora of insight and knowledge that we have about other countries and the tissue of relationships we have with other countries. And I'm not, academia is, I think, obviously I would say this as an academic, wouldn't I? I think it's a useful avatar and vehicle for insight, and often certain forms of deep insight. It's by no means the only one. And the danger slightly is that academics and journalists and diplomats and business people all look at each other and think, well, crikey, we know more than you do, right? And having inhabited some of these different silos, actually each of these silos brings different forms of insight, different forms of relationships. If I want to understand international financing of terrorism, or if I want to understand the evolution of technologies and geopolitics, I'm going to reach to the private sector. I'm not going to reach to government most of the time.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I move us back to UK governance? How do you think the transition from the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, the CSSF, to this integrated security fund will affect the UK's engagement on counter-terrorism internationally? Will it make any difference, or will it just remain the same? Will it remain the same or change?
So I think we'll have to see as that transition takes place. I wouldn't want to underestimate the degree to which the creation of pooled merged funding transformed the Whitehall landscape. And I'll explain, in fact, I don't think we're meant to say Whitehall anymore because obviously it's beyond London and the South East. Whitehall and Glasgow and York and Darlington, and I'm sure I haven't mentioned other places as well. I should remember that from my time in the Cabinet Office. But I think there is a hugely important ingredient here which is sometimes less spoken about. It's not just the shared funding and the ability to engage in capacity building or work on insight or support bilateral projects or multilateral projects. It's actually the fact that this shared funding required shared governance. And it required shared governance at grade 7 level in government, not just at senior civil service level in government. So it's one thing, often directors and director generals in government will work closely together because you're beginning to be in that apex system within central government. It's much more difficult to get, this bit of the MOD to work with this bit of the Home Office and this bit of FCDO. The huge value of these shared funds, from my perspective, was it forced jointery with different operating cultures, with different parts of government. And that jointery helped educate. When I was doing CSSF in its early days, it was one of the vehicles for understanding defence insights into the international policy issues I was working on, and to understand development and Home Office insights into those policy areas. So I would hope, certainly no detrimental effect, I hope it continues that pathway of encouraging integration across government, but not without punishing the particular forms of vertical expertise or application that are also required.
Do you think there's a risk that the UK focuses too heavily on threats which only impact our national security? I mean, surely that would affect the threats of international terrorism more broadly. Isn't a threat to all of us a threat to each of us?
So, again, I perhaps would parry a little bit. I mean, I think what you've seen consistently is a combination of the two. Yes, you've seen successive governments, right back to the 1960s, prioritise threat to the UK homeland and to British citizens. So there was more investment in countering Northern Ireland-based groups or groups that were targeting the UK rather than international terrorist groups that didn't. The UK invested more resource combating November 17th in Greece because it targeted British personnel and threatened British tourists than it did on Sendero Luminosa in Peru, which did less targeting of British citizens or officials.
Sorry to interrupt you. Shouldn't we be equally concerned about the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo publication as anything here in the UK? Because France, what happens in France could easily happen here.
Absolutely. So I think on the one hand, prioritisation of UK citizens as the prime focus seems reasonable to me, and at least as a UK citizen, I would also, I think, expect that of government. At the same time, the British government has invested, over many years in that international architecture, investing in the capabilities of the International Civil Aviation Organisation. It's not an organisation that trips off a tongue, but it plays a hugely important role in aviation security and airport security. The UK invested in that. That had a beneficial effect for all, not just for the UK. Some of the capacity building work that the UK has done will be in countries where there is there's no prime threat to UK citizens or to UK interests, but there is a net interest. There is a particular area where this is a threat to one is a threat to all, because often the use of third countries as pathways as vectors to attack UK interests can be there. We saw that with foreign terrorist fighters, where if you didn't want to come up on a risk register by flying straight into Birmingham, what you did would you fly to Malta first and then fly to Birmingham, or you fly somewhere else, fly to Latin America and then fly to the UK. So all countries are relevant to the threat to the UK. All countries are also relevant to the important principle that it's not all right to threaten or kill or maim civilians in the name of a violent ideology, whatever that violent ideology might be. So that's where I think reasserting the universality of counter-terrorism is always important for the UK government. It's a fundamental moral principle as well.
Absolutely.
Is there anything, Professor Evans, that perhaps we should have asked you and didn't, or that you might like to add before we wrap up?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, all I would say is I do think the technology aspect on this is hugely important. And that's not just in the context of radicalisation, online and self-radicalisation. It's also about the peer-to-peer ability to share capabilities and to improve the competence and danger posed by terrorist groups. That is something that is of live concern to the UK government and to other governments. But I think it's something that should be very firmly on our radar.
Thank you, Professor Evans. We'll end the session there. Thank you very much. Order.
Thank you.